You're listening to The Unsafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
So he's tempted to express, because he's drunk, his anger and do something that he probably shouldn't do. And as many people do when they've had too much to drink, he goes ahead and does it anyhow. The foreign god that captured the heart of his grandfather and corrupted the court, he's going to take care of. That's what his decision is. So he does something that no one else ever did. None of the kings before him did this.
I'm sure you can tell that this story isn't going to end well for King Belshazzar and the Babylonian Empire. To begin with, being drunk and throwing a party while the city is under siege wasn't a great idea. Arrogance and pride made King Belshazzar to do the worst possible thing he could have done. He directly challenged God. The best part of this story is that God responds in a way that leaves the king so scared that he turns pale. In today's message, Pastor Ken will show you why you don't mess with Yahweh. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Daniel, chapter 5, as he continues his message, The Fall of Babylon.
The date of Belshazzar's feast can be determined with a high degree of precision. In other words, we know the date. The Chronicle states that on the 16th day of the month Tishri in Nabonidus' 17th year, Saturday, October 12th, 539 BC, the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle. So we're talking about events that take place on the evening of October 11th and in the morning of October 12th, 539 BC. So now you can wow your friends and neighbors at parties and say, I know, anyway. But that's the date that is actually in that cylinder. So in Daniel 1, if you remember, we saw a refusal by these four young men to eat the king's food. And in chapter 4, we saw a king humbled in eating a diet of grass. Now we see a king using food to control his nervous rulers. They're getting drunk. Let's just be honest about it. They're having a party, and the intent is to get them hammered. That's what the king wants to do. He wants them to forget what's going on outside. And the party is all about praising the gods of Babylon. Now, Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He was there, and he saw his granddad go crazy. And he saw his granddad regain his wisdom and his knowledge, and he saw him and heard him give praise to Yahweh. He knows all of that. He's rejected it, totally rejected it. But he knows all of this. So what he's doing, he can't say, I didn't know. He knew. He absolutely knew. So in his drunken stupor, he is mad at what happened to his granddad. He's mad at Yahweh. He's mad at everything. So he's tempted to express, because he's drunk, his anger and do something that he probably shouldn't do. And as many people do when they've had too much to drink, he goes ahead and does it anyhow. The foreign god that captured the heart of his grandfather and corrupted the court, he's going to take care of. That's what his decision is. So he does something that no one else ever did. None of the kings before him did this. He calls for the vessels that are in the storehouse that were captured and brought from the temple. He's going to show the gods of Babylon are superior to all foreign gods, even Yahweh, in opposition to what his grandfather had said. So this is his goal. This is what he's trying to do. The real reason that he's doing this is with the God for whose glory these items that they're drinking from have been made. He knew about Nebuchadnezzar's supernatural experiences. He knew about the God who stood behind the vessels. He knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar and that Nebuchadnezzar worshiped Yahweh, and yet he rejected it. And he's rejected it so much to the point now that in his alcohol-encouraged state, he's going to blaspheme God. Not a good thing to be doing. By the way, there's actually an atheist today who has what he's published calls the Blasphemy Challenge. He'll give a person a free book of his if they'll go and record them blaspheming the Holy Spirit and then send them the video. 27 people have taken him up on it so far. Pray for them, okay? Really. But that is stuff that's going on today. So back to Babylon. The site of the rebellion in Genesis 11. Okay, remember, that's what happened here. And I made that point. And Timonaki was on the grounds of another ziggurat that was built by a guy by the name of Nimrod. This is where this all happened. And we have a king now who's not learned the lesson learned by his granddad. And he's taking the ultimate next step of not only using the vessels dedicated to Yahweh and the service in the temple, but he's going to toast fallen divine beings with implements designed to worship Yahweh. Nothing is sacred to this guy. Nothing. And he wants to draw his inner circle and have them do the same thing that he is doing. Isn't that interesting? He's going to do this, and he wants everybody else to participate in this with him under threat of death. So here we are in the middle of this party, and there are women there too. It's a violation of normal things, and we have an appearance of the supernatural. Verse 5. So they're drinking, they're doing all this stuff. And on the wall, immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared. And I desperately want it to be the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard. Okay? That's what I wish. It doesn't say that, but in my mind's eye, I'm kind of like, I'll get your attention. Especially when you consider that the walls were covered with lime and they didn't have paint. So here this hand shows up and is writing on it. So it could be that. You know, let's go with that. So this human hand appears and writes on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. So here's the lampstand. This way everybody can see this hand write it. And the king saw the hand as he wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. We're going to go into the Aramaic of this, because as we study it, I get chuckles. His limbs gave way, and that's not the only thing that did, and his knees knocked together. Okay, so he goes from being this brazen, drunk fool to he's sober. Boy, is he sober. The king, by the way, when he saw this hand, those fingers that he sees are the same ones that the last time they wrote on a stone tablet, and they wrote the Ten Commandments. It's the same hand. Okay? And by the way, here it is, Exodus 31:18. And he gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Same finger, okay? So if he can write in stone, he can write on a line-covered wall. And since Yahweh is a spirit, this visible manifestation of Yahweh, the fingers, is most likely the second power in heaven, which means it's the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Again. Now, we know that Jesus Christ also does some writing too. And the last time Jesus wrote, he upset a few people. Right? In John chapter 8, verse 3 to 11, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman. Now, Jesus is in the temple. This is after he's presented himself as Messiah, and this is prior to his death and resurrection. So it's after Palm Sunday, but before he's put on trial. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the center of the court, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman's been caught in adultery, in the very act. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say?" They were saying this, testing him, so that they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. Now, I think what he's writing is Isaac, Ruth, and Abigail, and he's writing down what these guys have done. That's what I think he's doing, okay? Or things that they thought about. But he's writing on this, and they persisted asking him. He straightened up and said to him, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he stoops down and starts writing about Good old John standing there, And when they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones, because they're looking over his shoulder and they're seeing what he's writing on the ground. He knows everything, and he's writing it down, and he's showing it to them. Do I have any doubt that there is a record? Jesus is keeping track of it. He knows. The beautiful thing for us, though, as believers, is this. That record of what we've done wrong doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. The only record that remains is Jesus died for us, and when the Father looks at us, he sees Jesus. Our sins have been forgiven. They're not being written on the ground. But there are others that record's still there. If you want to see a record of how God takes care of believers and what he keeps track of and the detail to it, the first couple of chapters of 1 Chronicles is incredibly boring because it's what this family did and this family did and this family did and this family did. That's God showing us he keeps track. Okay? That's what he does. He keeps track. But I love it. Straightening out, they all leave. And the woman, where she was in the center of the court, straightens up. Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "I don't condemn you either. Go now and sin no more." And I'm sure he's doing this because she doesn't need to read their problems. But they all saw him doing that. Doesn't say in the scriptures what he wrote, but what would make them leave? That's what would make them leave. So the finger of God, when he did the Ten Commandments, that upset some people, still does today. And then he upsets the king because he writes on the wall. And he writes 3 financial terms, by the way. That's what he writes. And then Jesus did the same thing. So what's the king's reaction to the writing? I love this. He sees the back of the hand. So all he sees is this part of the hand. Here's the writing, and he sees this hand. His face grew pale. Now that's the word shana, okay? And it means to be pale or to become abnormally deficient in color, as suggesting physical or emotional distress. He went from a nice normal pallor to death immediately. I mean, just like that. His thoughts alarmed him. That's the word bahal. Kind of almost sounds like bawling, where he's crying out, but no, it's bahal. It means frightened, troubled, terrified. That's what it means, okay? So his face grew pale. In other words, he's under emotional distress. He's white as a sheet. And for someone who is from the Middle East and has a darker skin tone, that's probably tough. His thoughts alarmed him. He's terrified. He is absolutely terrified. And it gets worse. His hip joints went slack. That's the word sarah. It means to feel faint or weak in the legs. It is a condition caused by utter fear. All of a sudden he can't stand. And what goes along with that is he also can't control his other areas of his body, like his bowels. He may have needed a new pair of breeches when this was all over with, is what I'm saying. He's having a problem. He's in utter fear. And his knees began knocking. That's the word nakash. There's so many different words that sound like nakash, nikash. You got different words that are like. But what this means is to knock together. One knee impacting another. The figurative extension of the phrase, the knees knock together, and one of the other dictionaries I looked at, it says loudly knocking together. So if you didn't see what was happening to him, you heard his legs doing this. You heard his knees actually knocking against each other. This guy's scared out of his mind. Or put in more modern terms, these are good terms, the king was terrified to the point that he lost physical control, virtually collapsing from the terror. And when I say physical control, I mean he lost physical control. Things that a king should not be doing, he still shouldn't be doing, but he did them. And I also think, based on the words and the language in here, he probably needed to change the clothes too. Verse 7, the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. Now, did they work out well for Nebuchadnezzar when he called them? Are they going to work out well again this time? Oh, no, not at all. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. That's how we know it's Nabonidus, Belshazzar, and then whoever. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing. Well, they could. It's in Aramaic. It's there for everybody to see. They didn't want to read the writing. They told him he couldn't read the writing or make known the king the interpretation. And it says, then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. It's getting worse. It's not getting better for the king. It's absolutely getting worse for him. Whether or not these assorted advisors could answer or not is immaterial. They did not answer. They could be looking at that and saying, yeah, it's Aramaic. It's 3 financial terms. I know exactly what it means, but I'm not telling you. We've seen your predecessor take people out in the street and knock their heads off. We're not going to tell you bad news. The terms are plain. It's financial terms of the day. It's in Aramaic. It's the language they read all the time. They know it. They know the language. They're just not going to answer it because it's bad news, probably. You know, you tell us a hand showed up from the middle of nowhere and wrote on the wall. Okay, let's see. There were some supernatural things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar, and it was bad news, and it was bad news, and it was bad. No, we're not going to talk. Sorry. Yeah, we don't know. We can't see it. We have no idea. So history repeats itself, just like it did in chapter 2, verses 10 to 13, and chapter 4, verses 4 to 7. The counselors say the same thing that they've said before. I don't know. I can't understand this. I can't tell you. And they're ignorant for whatever reason. The net impact, the king's appearance becomes even worse. He looks like death warmed over. He can't control his bodily functions. You see a guy his hands are shaking, his feet are shaking, his knees are shaking. He cannot control his bodily functions. He's probably slobbering, and he's really a wreck. But he's sober now, right? And so is everybody else, by the way, in the room. Now, not only was the tumult that arose, now, you remember, just think about how everybody's concerned. The noise that these 1,000 people are making. It's a noise. It's a loud, confusing talk of the king and the nobles. But the queen mother who lives in the palace, she overhears this. She hears this noise. She's not there. Now, the queen mother, the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, probably is also a believer. She saw what happened to her husband and knows what took place. She's staying away from this stuff. But she hears the noise. So she goes into the banqueting hall and gives her 10 cents. The queen, because the words of the king and his lords, so she hears the yelling. She lives upstairs or wherever, and she hears this noise. So she comes down, what is going on? What are they doing? It's bad enough we got an army outside, now these guys are doing this. She comes to the banqueting hall, and the queen declares, she knows how to address appropriately. She was with the king before. O king, live forever, and let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. She saw what was going on with him. He's got a problem, and she sees it. Talks about it immediately, knows there's an issue with him. There's a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And where did she pick that up from? Nebuchadnezzar, okay? She has heard Daniel speak. She knows what happened to her husband. She knows. In the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, or to put it in modern terms, your grandfather the king, and you almost could hear her say, now that was a real king. Not like you, but the way she puts it, your grandfather, and then it's kind of like your grandfather, the king, he was a real king. She's kind of like, you're not really worthy of this. Made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, astrologers, because of an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, who the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he'll show the interpretation. Now, the fact that the queen has to remind Belshazzar about Belteshazzar, by the way, their names are real close together, who Daniel was, indicates that the king scarcely knew him. The king had ignored him, didn't want to spend time with him, didn't want to learn who he was. Doesn't surprise us. He hated God. He would hate Daniel, too. He would have nothing to do with him. He would have had reasons to steer clear of this guy because he's the reason why my granddad became a Yahweh lover. He destroyed the family. It's all his fault. Yeah, but Daniel also may have been the one, according to the rabbis, who took care of Nebuchadnezzar when he was fruitier than a loon for 7 years and made sure everything was still okay and that there was no rebellion. But he wasn't part of that. He knew that, and he didn't want any part of Daniel. Well, guess what? Daniel now is his only solution. Her attitude, by the way, and I love this, doesn't match the gravity of the situation. Did you pick up on that? She knows what's going on. She knows there's an army outside. She knows her grandson is an idiot. I mean, she even points out the fact that your granddad, he was a king. We'll see Daniel say pretty much the same thing. Nebuchadnezzar, he was a king. You're not so much. But even though she doesn't understand, or it seems like she doesn't understand, she has a different attitude than everybody else. She's not concerned. Which tells me again, she may be a believer. She doesn't care. God's got it under control. You don't. But her suggestion is a good one. Summon Daniel, the king's greatest advisor. Her words reveal another characteristic of King Belshazzar. He's an ignorant fool. He's a drunk, ignorant fool. He's a very suddenly sobered up, drunk, ignorant fool, but he's still an ignorant fool. He didn't know about Daniel, one of the highest officers in Babylon? Yeah, right. I don't believe that. He's the wisest counselor in the kingdom. He had been told about his grandfather's dreams and Daniel's interpretation. He was there. He knows. He knows. He didn't want to remember him. That's the big thing. But, he's a young man. He's a young leader. He's concerned about himself. He wants to get caught up. He's in the present. He wants to make sure he leaves a legacy. So I don't need that Daniel guy. Yeah, okay, fine. So once again, Daniel is called before the king. Now, can you imagine what Daniel's doing right now? He's busy re-looking at his notes from chapter 6 and chapter 7, or chapter 7 and chapter 8, rather. He's sitting there saying, I'm really trying to struggle with what this means here. And he's looking at that, and he's praying, and he's really seeking the Lord, trying to understand what the prophecy is that he saw. And then you get to knock on the door. Yeah, what is it? The king needs to see you. Again? It's been 25 years. But now the king needs to see him again. Does he know what he's walking into? He knows there's an enemy around the city. He knows that. Everybody knows that. He knows they're having a party. I'm sure they're not quiet. But does he care? Probably not. But now he's called into this situation. He doesn't know what happened. He doesn't know what he's walking into. But God will give him the vision and whatever he needs to know. He knows that. He knows, by the way, the city's under siege. Okay?
You've been listening to The Unsafe Bible with Pastor Ken. The series Pastor Ken's been teaching through is the prophetic book of Daniel. It's a fascinating glimpse into things that were predicted to happen in the future. Daniel was one of the upright men of character that God trusted to see what was ahead. It wasn't always something that Daniel was able to grasp. In fact, some of the visions he saw made him sick. When you think about the future and what's been predicted, can you imagine having a lens into that? It might be rather terrifying to see all the ways mankind gets in his own way, and how every culture ultimately comes to destruction. But this isn't where the story ends. God entrusted Daniel with these visions so there would be a visible and noticeable end to the current situation of the world. God promised a new king would come and make things right, restoring the world in a new way. If you like what you heard today but need some additional direction or understanding on this, go to theunsafebible.com and click on the Connect tab. You can submit a Connect card, and then someone can get in touch with you and try to help answer those questions you have. If you're in the Jupiter, Florida area, we want to invite you to meet with us in person. Find more details on our website, theunsafebible.com. In the meantime, you can find more messages from this series in Daniel by looking under the Media tab at theunsafebible.com. Pastor Ken has more to share from this book next time, here on The Unsafe Bible.